Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another session of Karwan Online History Festival Season 2. I'm Ishan Sharma, and today I'm honored and delighted to have Dr. Dinyar Patel sir among us for a lecture on Dadabhai Naoroji, an Indian first, Dadabhai Naoroji, and Swaraj. Dr. Patel was an assistant professor of history at the University of South Carolina from 2015 to until 2020, and this August he will be joining the SP Jain Institute of Management and Research in Mumbai, as an assistant professor. His biography of Dadabhai Naoroji, pioneer of Indian nationalism, published by Harvard University Press and HarperCollins India, was released in India on 1st of July. He is the co-editor of two edited volumes and has written for BBC News, the New York Times Online, The Hindu, Himal South Asia, and Scroll.in. So it is truly an honor and a privilege to have Dr. Patel today. Thank you very much, sir, for accepting our invitation, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ishan. And thank you again to Karwan for inviting me for this lecture series. It seems that you've had some great speakers, so I'm honored to be a part of this. So let me begin by starting my presentation. So this is the book of mine that's just come out. It's as Ishan mentioned, it was published by Harvard University Press and HarperCollins in India. And my talk is based on the book. I've titled it an Indian First because in many ways Dadabhai Naoroji was the first Indian to achieve certain things, such as a particular brand of economic analysis of Indian poverty. He was the first Indian to really champion a lot of the nationalist platform. But in other ways, he was an Indian first as well. I mean, he was someone who always identified first as an Indian rather than, say, a Parsi or a person from Bombay or a person from a particular class, religion, or caste. So his idea of India as a nation was one where, again, you would identify as being an Indian rather than a particular background. And I think that's an important thing to consider in terms of how that idea has evolved in India since then. So let me begin by talking a little bit about what we know about Naoroji and try to build off that to discuss more about Naoroji the person. We know that Naoroji was concerned about poverty. I mean, when you're taught about Naoroji in school, you'll probably be taught about his drain theory. And indeed, Naoroji was very concerned about the rapid impoverishment of India, and particularly how that impoverishment was creating a mass series of famines in the late 19th century. He lived through he didn't witness firsthand necessarily, but he knew what was going on in large parts of the subcontinent, where literally millions of people died in the second half of the 19th century due to famine. A lot of it very preventable. So many people know about his book, Poverty and Un-British Rule, which in fact was a compilation of all the different economic work that he had done throughout his life. And people know also that he was involved in British politics by being the first Indian or the first Asian elected to Parliament in 1892. And indeed, he served for about 3 years in Parliament. Beyond that, not much, again, of Dadabhai Naoroji is known. So I'll begin my talk by talking about the particular sources that I worked with in order to come through and write this biography. And again, I'm not sure how many of listeners here have worked in archival repositories in Delhi or other places in India. But in order to do any really important piece of historical scholarship, you, of course, have to go right to the sources, right? And that means going to archives. And working in archives can sometimes be difficult for many reasons in India. In the first case, a lot of archival collections are vast and have not been well catalogued or well utilized in the past by other scholars. So I began my research at the National Archives of India in Delhi, and the collection I used, Dadabhai Naoroji's papers, are absolutely huge. There are 30,000 documents in size, and what you see over here is a photograph of roughly maybe half of the collection. Each of those boxes contain papers belonging to Naoroji, but these are only a small portion of the boxes that make up the collection. And inside each particular box, you could have 50 to 60 files, depending on how much the box has been overstuffed. And you open up a file and you get particular letters. A lot of these letters are quite badly damaged. And this is another reality, a sad reality of working with archives in India. Whereas in other countries, historical preservation has been quite good. I mean, if you go to the British Library in London, you can read letters that look almost like they were written yesterday. And they might be 150 years old. In India, it's been much more difficult. I mean, the climate is much worse for archival preservation. And oftentimes, those preservation technologies that should be used have not been employed. So we know within Naoroji's collection that what we have today is only about half of what has historically existed. Again, not all of this is the fault of the National Archives of India. A lot of the material was lost before the papers were put in there in the 1960s. But the collection that survives is oftentimes in quite a damaged state, as you can see from these images. Oftentimes, the preservation methodologies that have been used have not been entirely good. They've caused more damage. A lot of material in India continues to be laminated, whereby kind of like see-through paper is slapped on and on the bottom of letters. And this actually causes more damage than good in the long term. Over time, stuff gets very brittle and it can be very hard to read this material. Another problem is that a lot of the ink that was used in the 19th century was very acidic in content. And over decades, it reacts with the paper and it causes paper to literally disintegrate. So when you open up a letter, sometimes it can literally fall apart in your hand. I had this experience quite often when I was working in the National Archives in Delhi. And again, material can fade in quality. A lot of the letters in the Naoroji collection are actually carbon copies of letters that were sent out to other correspondents. And those carbon copies are extremely brittle and fragile, and it's oftentimes very hard to read the material today. Again, so you come across material like this where you read literally holes. And again, what do you do with a collection like this, where you just have scraps of paper of material that is not very easy to read? This is oftentimes the type of material that you have to deal with. So it's quite a challenging task to deal with any sort of historical collection in dealing with India, because the legions of problems that affect the quality of the paper and affect the size of the collection. So using the material that I was able to collect, let me try to reconstruct for you a little bit about what Naoroji's life was like, and what he achieved during his life, and how precisely he became an Indian first in many ways. So he was born in Bombay, but his family roots come from a little bit further to the north, from the town of Navsari in southern Gujarat. Naoroji was a Parsi, and his family was a member of the Parsi Zoroastrian priesthood. And up until relatively recently, most of the Parsi priesthood was centered in places like Navsari. And his family had a long priestly antecedent living in this town. And in fact, if you go to Navsari today, you will see a house that is commonly believed to be Naoroji's birthplace. Gandhi himself came to this house in 1921 to pay his respects to Dadabhai Naoroji. But in fact, this was not where Naoroji was born. It's a common misconception. He was born in Bombay. And he was born specifically in a district called Khadak, which, as I've tried to indicate on this map from 1855 of what was then called the native town, was located roughly halfway between CST, or the old VT train station, and JJ Hospital, Jamshedji Jiji Hospital, in an area that today is known as Bindi Bazar. So very thickly populated area still to this day. And he grew up in a relatively poor household. I mean, his family had migrated from Navsari due to poverty and probably due to famine in the area around Navsari. So he lived and he grew up in relative poverty. But the one thing that really changed his life quite early on was that he had an opportunity to participate in a rather novel form of public education that was jointly administered by both British people and Indians in the early 20th century. There was something called the Bombay Native Education Society that was set up under Mount Stuart Elphinstone, who was the governor of Bombay at the time. And it was meant to provide education for free to deserving Indian students. Now, this at the time was a relative novelty, regardless of where you were in the world. Public education was not really evolved in places like Great Britain or even the United States. And in India, it was even more of a rarity. But this program nevertheless allowed individuals like Naoroji, who otherwise would not have benefited from good, solid education, to get relatively top-of-the-line education in the early 1800s. So Naoroji was educated in an English medium school, which again was quite a rarity at this time. So he grew up being taught by actual British teachers, and he got as good an education, consequently, as perhaps the richest Indian could have got at this point in time, even though he came from a desperately poor background. Another reality for Naoroji's youth was marriage. In this era, child marriages were the norm, of course, throughout India, and that included the Parsi community as well. And when Naoroji was 11 years old, he was married to a 7-year-old girl called Gulbai Shroff. The marriage lasted about 70 years. It wasn't a very happy marriage. Gulbai was not educated, and she apparently had relatively limited interest in learning. And for that reason, it was not terribly happy, because Naoroji was someone who was very actively involved in education, and he apparently tried to teach his wife how to learn to read and such. But nevertheless, this was the reality that anyone in India would have had to have faced at this point in time, a very early marriage. Now, Naoroji's schooling in this public education system ended when he was around 15 years of age, 14, 15 years of age. And his record in school was so good that it qualified him to join Elphinstone College in the early 1840s. Now, Elphinstone, which still survives today, was considered the premier college for any upwardly mobile Indian from the 1840s upward. So anyone from the vast sweep of Western India, not just Bombay, who was a promising scholar would have been enrolled here. Elphinstone College today is located in Kalagoda in Bombay, at this building that you see on the screen today. In Naoroji's time, it was located in a different area, in an area called Dhobi Talao, close by to, for those of you who are familiar with Bombay, Metro Cinema. So he was enrolled in the school. And the interesting thing about Elphinstone College was that it wasn't just British teachers who were teaching here. There were also Indians. I mean, again, this is another way in which Elphinstone was quite a progressive institution at this time. So two of Naoroji's teachers were Indians. One was Bal Gangadhar Shastri Jambekar, who was a brilliant Maharashtrian polymath, who unfortunately died when he was very young, about 33 years of age. And the other professor of his was a fellow Parsi called Naoroji Fardunji, who was a little older than him. And Dadabhai Naoroji and Naoroji Fardunji became lifelong friends thereafter. But under these two Indians, as well as other British professors, Naoroji really distinguished himself. He was praised for his work in fields ranging from political economy to optics to what we today would be calling physics. Back in that era, it would be called natural philosophy, English language, calculus. So he really distinguished himself. And one of his British professors even called him the promise of India. So here at, again, a very young age, and Naoroji was perhaps no more than 17, 16 years of age at this point in time, Naoroji was already being identified for his skills by his teachers. Now, the problem is that once you left an institution like Elphinstone College in this era, you had very few options about what to do with your education. You could join the government. You could try to become a lawyer, which again was a field open to Indians at this point in time. You can join mercantile companies that were stewarded by Indians. But again, oftentimes you would be actually at a disadvantage in such places because if you wanted to work, for example, like an Indian mercantile company, you would have been brought in at a much earlier age and trained on the spot. So you already were at a bit of a disadvantage. So Naoroji decided to go back to school, quite literally, and join Elphinstone College as a teacher. He was what was called a native assistant, someone who helped translate language lectures from, say, Marathi or Gujarati in his case, to English and vice versa. So he was kind of a middleman between British professors and Indian students. But over time, he rose through the ranks. He became an acting professor, an assistant professor, And he taught subjects like mathematics, and we have examples of his test papers that he used to give his students. And in time, he became the first Indian professor at a British college. So this is one way in which he was an Indian first. He was the first Indian to rise to the status of a professor and be on par with British professors, again, at a relatively young age. He achieved this when he was around 28 years of age. The other thing that really distinguished Naoroji at this point in time was that while he was teaching at Elphinstone, he was also very interested in a whole slew of social and religious reform efforts that were going on in Bombay at this point in time. This was an era when Indians were starting to grasp with ideas of reform that came in from Great Britain through things such as the Scottish Enlightenment, and started to ask questions like, should women get educated? Because at this point in time, most Indian women were not educated at all. And some of the more lucky ones might have been educated at home, but there certainly were very few female schools which taught education to women. So Naoroji was one of the first few Indians in Bombay at this point in time who really started to feel that female education was something worthwhile. And he helped start a network of girls' schools in Bombay in the late 1840s that started off on a relatively unpromising note. I mean, most conservative Indian fathers were unwilling to allow their daughters to go to these schools, but Naoroji and others persisted. And the reason why Naoroji really persisted was that at this point in time, from the educational background he had, he believed very strongly in an idea of gender equality. A little later on, he gave this quote to you that's on this quote that's on the screen, and you can see that he really kind of enunciates an idea that both women and men in India should exercise the same rights and responsibilities, which even today, as we know, is quite a revolutionary concept. But he felt that education was the way in which to impart some sort of gender equality. And for that reason, he really put his heart and soul into this effort at female education. And within a few years, this network of schools that Naoroji helped set up grew in size from about 50 students to around 500 to 600 students. So from that point on, it caught on throughout the city and other parts of the Bombay presidency as well. Naoroji's other passion at this point was journalism. He helped establish a newspaper called Ras Guftar, which was both English and Gujarati, which survived until the very early 20th century. And Ras Guftar, which translated to the voice of truth in Gujarati, was meant to be, again, a reformist vehicle. It talked about the need for social reform, religious reform. It was meant to impart educational ideas to the poor. So in this sense, it was delivered for a very nominal cost, or sometimes would be free, because it was meant to kind of educate those who were too poor to afford a school education. And it was a wildly successful paper. It might have been the most popular newspaper in terms of circulation by the early 1870s, late 1860s. And Naoroji was one of its first editors and one of its founders. And all of these efforts added up to a period of reform going on in Bombay that was called Young Bombay, which was in many ways kind of the counterpart to what you had in Bengal, Young Bengal, a few decades beforehand. And it was, in this sense, a vehicle for Bombay's political awakening. For activities like social and religious reform, quite naturally led to people taking up issues of political reform. So just as you have these girls' schools being set up, or papers like Ras Guftar being set up, people in Bombay also started setting up political societies, like the Bombay Association, which was founded in 1851. And these were the first societies in Western India to really kind of grapple the ideas of what British rule was like, critique it, and talk about ways that Indians could participate in their government. Now, Naoroji left Bombay at a relatively early age. He left in the year 1855 when he was 30 years of age, and he went to London in order to help a group of Parsis set up a business in London and Liverpool. And this departure of Naoroji and his colleagues was so momentous that it actually made the newspapers at this point in time. I mean, this is a newspaper from June 1855 where you can see that it's actually being discussed in a Bombay literary society. what will happen when this group of Indians go to London and Liverpool to set up their own business. Because this was reputed to be the first time that Indians actually went to England in order to set up a major commercial concern. Now, the commercial concern in question had to do with cotton, but as Naoroji discovered, it was also about much more than just commerce. When Dadabhai Naoroji goes to England for the first time in 1855, he sees Europe for the first time. And it really fills him with wonder because he travels through places like Paris, the French countryside, and eventually England in order to reach his final destination. And he's absolutely stunned by how prosperous these places are, especially France. I mean, when he's traveling by train through the French countryside, he compares it with the poor countryside that he's seen in India, and he's amazed at how wealthy that people are in comparison to his fellow Indians. So it really instilled him with the idea, again, of poverty existing in India and prosperity existing in Europe. And a lot of this dimension between poverty and prosperity had a lot to do with the cotton trade. Naoroji's company in London and Liverpool dealt almost exclusively with cotton. And in the 1850s, cotton was emerging as the main source of wealth in Bombay. Bombay exported raw cotton and it imported cotton goods from London that were manufactured in places like Lancashire or Manchester. And Naoroji was involved in this cotton trade. He tried to kind of reverse this cotton dynamic in the sense of providing machinery to some of the first cotton mills in India that could somehow break this monopoly of British manufacture of cotton goods. But cotton was, again, a key ingredient in explaining poverty and prosperity between India and Great Britain. And this came home during the American Civil War, which took place in the early 1860s. Now, during the American Civil War, as some of you may know, India for a small period of time experienced a boom in wealth and prosperity because the cotton that had been grown in the American South and shipped to Great Britain to be turned into cloth was no longer available, thanks to hostilities. So Great Britain turned to India as a source of its cotton. And for 4 short years, cotton manufacturing relied almost exclusively on Indian raw cotton. And this created vast commercial fortunes in places like Bombay. It made Bombay extremely wealthy. And this wealth trickled down to a certain degree to cultivators in India as well. But as quickly as this boom started, it ended. Once the American Civil War ended, America was once again open for business, and America once again took the lion's share of supplying cotton to Manchester and Lancashire. The price for cotton decreased, and cotton exports from India slumped dramatically. And this caused many Indian firms, including Dadabhai Naoroji's firm, to go bankrupt. So this caused a major commercial slump in India. And the other thing that was going on in India at this point in time, that again really kind of crystallized Naoroji's views on poverty existing in India, was a slew of famine. Beginning in the 1860s, India was hit by a number of really, really devastating famines where millions of people died. We don't know the precise figures for many of these famines because it was virtually impossible for anyone to get a head count of just how devastating these famines were. But in 1866, just after the American Civil War ended and India was experiencing this decline in fortunes after the end of the cotton boom, famine hit Orissa in eastern India. And we know that roughly 1 in 3 people in Orissa, about 1 million people at this point in time, died on account of famine. And this shocked Naoroji. He was in England at this point in time. He didn't witness it firsthand, but he received news reports from the ground in India, and he was amazed that something as cataclysmic as famine could cause, again, 1 in 3 people to die. So he became extremely interested in investigating why famines were occurring in India. And this was the germ that began his economic investigations. This is how Naoroji became the first really modern economic thinker. What he tried to do was go through economic data that was being generated in India and understand why India was so poor, why it was constantly on the cusp of things like famines. And this was the birth of his idea of the drain of wealth. What Naoroji basically did was take economic data that was produced by British authorities, and the British would compile economic statistics in every province based on the harvest of things like wheat or cotton or opium. And he took this data, he interrogated it, he found shortcomings in this data, and he added his own inputs. So if you look at this graphic from a paper that he had called The Poverty of India from 1876, he takes data that the British have compiled on wheat harvests in parts of northern India, and he writes his own notations, talking about where he thinks things have gone wrong, where he thinks estimates are incorrect, or whereby the methods of creating those estimates are incorrect. And again, he supplements it with reports that he's received from friends on the ground, whether they be farmers or people involved in the cotton industry or the jute industry in Calcutta. And he comes up with his own set of economic data. And at the same time, he also travels through large parts of Western India, especially in Gujarat, to investigate conditions on the ground. So Naoroji was not just sitting in an ivy tower at this point in time. It wasn't just an academic study. He was going on the ground when he traveled back to India and interviewing farmers and interviewing local cultivators and seeing what exactly was going on and why conditions were so bad for Indian farmers. And this is essentially what he comes to the conclusion about. He comes to the conclusion that on average, the average Indian earned about 40 shillings or roughly 2 British pounds a year in terms of average Indian income. He basically took the gross Indian income that he calculated based on his own estimates, divided it by the Indian population, and this became the first ever estimate that we have of India's gross average income. And as you can see, 2 pounds contrasts quite vividly with what the average income was in Great Britain, which was 33 pounds. Not very high, but still 15 times greater than what the average Indian could hope to achieve. Now, 2 pounds by itself doesn't really mean much for us, but Naoroji tried to again quantify what an Indian could do with 2 pounds to live upon in a given year. And to give you a comparison of just how little an Indian could do with this, he took the diet that was prescribed to coolies who were sent out from Calcutta to places like Martinique or Malaysia or the West Indies. And the diet that was given to these emigrant coolies was for meeting just the minimum standards that would allow them to keep alive, right? Because they're being kept on a boat for several months. They don't need a very robust diet in order to do manual labor. So this is a very meager diet that's being given to them. And as you can see, the amount of money that's being used to spend for a diet at 1 year for this very meager diet is roughly about 40 shillings. So the average Indian, therefore, could only afford the most meager of diets. And this came home even more from Naoroji's observation that 40 shillings is, first of all, quite a conservative estimate. In reality, maybe about 29 shillings. Of course, this changes dramatically if something like a famine occurs. So this explained, in a nutshell, why India was so poor. It was perpetually on the verge of famine because each and every Indian, with the exception of a few thousand people at the top, could only earn so much that they could barely stave off starvation. And when a famine happened, they quite naturally fell victims, and many of them died. So in this context, understanding how famine existed in India was a no-brainer. Now, Naoroji was not just a person to dwell on economic scholarship. He wanted to talk about ways to remedy this condition. And to do so, he talked about this phenomenon called the drain of wealth. He believed that Britain was directly impoverishing India. This was why the average Indian had so little money in the first place to rely upon. And to sketch it in a very schematic and rough way, he described specifically how wealth was being siphoned off from India. So if you look in this graphic, I've in a very generic fashion talked about the wealth of India. And a certain percentage of that wealth is drained off via revenue that was raised by the British Indian government. And out of that revenue, a certain proportion was used to fund the salaries of Indian civil service officers. Now, the things about these Indian civil service officers is that most of them are British. Okay, most of them are British and will eventually retire to Great Britain. So their salaries, for the most part, don't rotate back into the Indian economy. They leave the country. So Naoroji came up with this idea that if you have a drain of wealth via civil servants eventually going back to Great Britain and spending their money in Britain in the first place, why don't you remedy the situation by employing more Indians? After all, if you employ more Indians as civil servants, you can get civil servants who themselves are Indians and who will cycle their revenues back into the Indian economy, because they're, of course, not leaving the country and going back to Britain after they retire. So this was one method whereby the drain of wealth took place. Now, it's important in this stage to understand that Naoroji knew that this was not the only source of the drain of wealth. He calculated that every year about 33 million pounds of wealth was drained out of India. And of that 33 million pounds, only a few million pounds were drained out through taxation and remittance of revenues given to Indian civil service officers. Wealth was drained through exports, through the fact that very high tariffs were in place, or very high rates of interest were given on capital invested in India by British companies. But he focused specifically on this idea of the civil service for one specific reason. It gave a political opening for some sort of administrative change. If you Indianize the civil service, you allow more Indians to join the Indian government. And that, in turn, was important for developing an idea that Naoroji started to think about in the late 1870s and the late 1880s. This idea eventually became what we call Swaraj. For India, it was self-government or something approaching self-government. But his idea was that if you have more Indians in the government in India, not only will you stop the drain of wealth, but then you'll move along to something like an Indian government for the Indians themselves. And this explains why people like Naoroji talk so much about something called simultaneous examinations. Now, many of you have heard about this in school. It was the idea that exams for joining the Indian civil service should not just take place in Great Britain, which was what they were done at this point in time, but should also take place in India. Because if you hold civil service exams only in Great Britain, most Indians could never hope to join, right? Because it was far away, it was very expensive to travel to Great Britain, and it was impossible for many Indians to leave due to caste restrictions that were imposed at this point in time, and again, just because it was so expensive. So if you have simultaneous exams and you have exams in India, you will be able to get more Indians to join the civil service, and that in turn will help stop the drain and will lead eventually to something like Swaraj, where Indians controlled their own government. So this was both a political and economic idea. And this is important in explaining the rest of Naoroji's political career. Now, while Naoroji was talking about these ideas of poverty, he was engaging with the ideas of many individuals contemporaneous to him. So one such individual was John Stuart Mill. Mill wrote about political economy, and Naoroji took his ideas and developed them. He talked about the great need for capital in India, but he pointed out that under British rule, capital was being drained. So he took Mill's ideas on capital in terms of wealth generation, and he used it against Great Britain. He said, under British rule, capital is being drained away, and as capital is being drained away, India in proportion grows more and more poor, because as there's less capital, less money can be invested in its agriculture or improving the lot of the average individual. Now, the other individual with Naoroji shared an intellectual relationship was Karl Marx. We don't know whether the two men ever met each other, but they had one friend in common, a man called Henry Hinman, who was a socialist politician and economic thinker, who was very interested in India. He never visited India, but he was an important British intellectual who spent a lot of his life writing about India. And through Hinman, Naoroji's ideas of a drain of wealth were likely transmitted to Karl Marx in the early 1880s. We know that in 1881, just a few short months and years before Marx passed away, he wrote a letter to a friend of his, a Russian economist, where he talked about a drain of wealth from India. And this letter was written just a few days after he met with Henry Hinman, and where Henry Hinman probably talked to him about the ideas of Dadabhai Naoroji and talked about this idea of a drain of wealth. So at the very end of Marx's life, you get some expression of Naoroji's economic views appearing in Marx's writing. And it would be interesting to speculate about what would happen if Marx and Naoroji had met in person and had a sustained intellectual conversation. Now, as I said, Naoroji's ideas were not just economic in nature, they were political as well. So since Naoroji had begun to talk about these ideas like Indian self-government, it was only natural that he started to think about how he and others could themselves influence the political direction of India to account for more Indian interest to be taken in regard. And the only way really to do this at this point in time, in his opinion, was to champion for Indian reform, not in India, but in Great Britain. In India, the government was extremely conservative. It was controlled by these British officers that really didn't want to see any change. But in Great Britain, there were a few reformist individuals in power, in parliament, and occasionally in power through elections, who had Indian interests in heart and who were very sympathetic towards the interests of Indians. So Naoroji in 1886 decides to sail to Great Britain after spending a period of about 5 or 6 years in India, and he decides to enter politics. Now, at this point in time, most Indians who were involved in nationalist politics were attracted to the Liberal Party. The Liberal and the Conservative Party were the two big political parties in Great Britain at this point in time. And the Liberal Party was under the control of William Gladstone, who was the longtime Prime Minister of Great Britain. But there were also individuals called the Radicals, people who were at the far left of the political spectrum in the Liberal Party, people like John Bright, who were advocates of political reform in Great Britain and also in the Empire. So John Bright felt very strongly that India needed political reform, and he supported a lot of Indians who demanded reform as well. So when Naoroji went to Great Britain in 1886, he met with people of both these streams, regular, mainstream liberals like Gladstone and more radical liberals such as John Bright, who wanted reform in India to take place immediately. But at the same time, there was another political stream that really interested Indians and Indian political thought, and that was the Irish. Now, at this point in time, Ireland was a part of Great Britain. It wasn't precisely a colony, but it wasn't at that point in time either really on equal footing as England, Scotland, and Wales. It was kind of caught in the middle. The Irish had representation in Parliament, and the person who led the Irish political party, the Irish party that was in power in Parliament, was a man called Charles Stewart Parnell. And he was considered, again, quite radical by British standards. He wanted some form of Irish self-government, but in comparison to other Irish individuals, he was quite moderate. There were Irish revolutionaries who were called the Fenians, and the Fenians advocated revolutionary violence against the British government in order to set up an Irish republic that was separate from Great Britain. The Fenians were very active in America amongst the Irish diaspora in places like New York and London, which is why on this graphic you see an American flag. But they were also influential amongst some Indians who took interest in politics. So some of the most radical Indians saw eye to eye with the Fenians and said, we in India need to pursue the same course that the Fenians did. And eventually a lot of revolutionaries who come out of India adopt this Fenian tactic of revolutionary politics. So these were two influences on Naoroji's thought, this liberal thought and what was going on in Ireland. And Naoroji took part in both political streams. He joined the Liberal political party. In 1886, for the first time, he stands as a candidate for election to the British Parliament from a place called Holborn in central London. Those of you who've been to London, the area around the British Museum is Holborn. So Naoroji tried to win election from this area. He ultimately failed, but he got his name out there, and he became better known in the Liberal Party as a consequence of his activities. But at the same time, he developed political alliances with the Irish. And one of his closest friends in the Irish camp was a man called Michael Davitt, who was himself a revolutionary who had gone to jail in the 1870s and 1880s, but who also had a parliamentary career. And in the mid-1880s, David actually suggests that Naoroji stand for the British Parliament from Ireland. So he actually suggested that a good way to express solidarity between the Irish and the Indians was to actually have an Indian represent Ireland in the British Parliament. So this unfortunately did not come to fruition, but it nevertheless is an interesting counterfactual to think of. Dadabhai Naoroji could not have just been the first Indian elected to Parliament, but he could have been the first Indian elected to Parliament from an Irish constituency. As you know, recently Ireland had an Indian Prime Minister. It could have had an Indian Member of Parliament 120 years before that. Now, as Naoroji took in regular liberal views, the ideas of the Irish, he was also reaching out to a new group of individuals, the socialists, who had come onto the political scene. There was a new socialist political party called the Social Democratic Federation, and it was led by a man called Henry Hinman, who again was the man who probably transmitted a lot of Naoroji's ideas to Karl Marx. Hinman and Naoroji were close friends. They had many ideas in common in terms of socialist principles, how Indian government should be reformed. So Naoroji embraced socialism within his political sphere, and using all three of these political streams, he really hit the ground running after his failed parliamentary attempt in order to woo the British electorate and build up his name recognition in order to talk about Indian political rights in Great Britain. So we know, for example, that he started to speak to gatherings of British workers and gatherings of British Labour members, and he expressed quite advanced socialist political views, where he talked about how labor and capital were oftentimes inimical and they're in relationship, and there was a struggle between the two, and the state needed to support labor in its struggle against capital. So in this sense, he's advocating quite socialist political views in Great Britain. At the same time, he embraces another new constituency, women. Now, in the 1880s, women, of course, were denied the vote in Great Britain. In this era, maybe roughly half of men in Great Britain had the right to vote, and another half were barred due to property restrictions or other restrictions put in place. And Naoroji, again, true to his belief in the equality of men and women and his interest in female education in India, becomes a vocal proponent of women's rights as well as female suffrage. So he joins a lot of suffrage associations and champions for the right of women to vote in Great Britain. And he becomes quite prominent in terms of supporters of female suffrage. So you can see in this flyer from a convention from the 1890s that was meant to be a women's convention, Naoroji is listed as a speaker alongside Rakhmabai, the famous Indian reformer of women's rights, and also Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was one of the most prominent American suffragists. So Naoroji was considered to be on that level in terms of supporters of suffrage at this point in time globally, not just in India, not just in Great Britain, but around the world. So when Naoroji turned to speaking about India, he had already gained a lot of friends because people in the left wing in Great Britain, or workers, or women, or socialists had already identified him as being a friend and someone who had their views and their interests in mind. So when he approached them about Indian rights, he basically said, I support you in your political rights. Can you support India in our political rights as well? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we're both struggling for some form of emancipation. And this strategy was actually quite popular. And it allowed Naoroji to launch a new campaign to enter the British Parliament. In 1888, he started campaigning in an area called Central Finsbury through the Liberal Party. Ultimately, elections only took place until 1892, so it was an extremely long campaign. But you can see in this election platform that Naoroji issued, Naoroji was not just talking about, say, rights for Indians. He was also talking about home rule for Ireland, some form of Irish self-government. He was talking about the liberalization of government in Great Britain for local government, free education, workers' rights, So all of these ideas were kind of linked together. Now, inevitably, for an Indian at this point in time trying to seek political office in Great Britain, he came up against a lot of racist opposition. People called him out for being a foreigner, for being words which I won't use in this presentation. But there was definitely a lot of nativist and racist reaction to an Indian trying to enter British politics. And nonetheless, then the Prime Minister of Great Britain at this point in time, a man called Lord Salisbury, who was conservative, told British voters that Naoroji was, quote unquote, a black man who did not deserve their vote. And this, somewhat strangely, catapulted Naoroji into a period of great name recognition in the early 1890s. A lot of British individuals were ashamed of Lord Salisbury's remark, just as, say, for example, a lot of Americans today are ashamed of Donald Trump's insinuations during the Black Lives Matter movement. And this consequently gained Naoroji a lot of sympathy. Let me just go back to the slide. Naoroji was overnight made into a celebrity, and he featured in cartoons in magazines such as Punch. I mean, here you have a cartoon of Naoroji being portrayed as Othello in the Shakespearean play, and the man who's being portrayed as the Doge of Westminster is Lord Salisbury. Naoroji even appeared in advertisements for commercial products. So here's an advertisement for a type of a pill in the 1890s where the advertisements basically makes use of this remark that Salisbury calls Naoroji as being a black man. And so that's how much Naoroji was known amongst the general public. He was appearing in the equivalent of advertisements in this era. And all of this really helped him in his parliamentary campaign, so much so that in 1892, when elections finally take place, Naoroji wins in central Finsbury. He wins by only 5 votes. It's an extremely, extremely contested parliamentary victory, and it goes into recount. But at the end of the day, Naoroji's victory is certified, and he becomes the first Indian elected to the British Parliament. Now, I'll just mention as an aside, several decades beforehand, there was a man called Dice Sombre, who was of partial Indian ancestry. He was an Anglo-Indian who was elected to the British Parliament as well. But Dice Sombre never identified as an Indian, and it's doubtful whether he actually sat in Parliament himself, because he was convicted of bribery and his election was ruled null and void. So in that sense, Naoroji was really the first Indian elected to Parliament, and he was the first man to really identify himself as a representative of Indians. Now, this, as you can imagine, was a huge moment back home in India. A group of very prominent Indians in Bombay get together and actually send a book of photographs to the voters of Central Finsbury, thanking them. And you can still see this book of photographs if you go to this part of London today. It's kept in a museum. This really catapults again Indian nationalism. It's a great moment where Indian nationalist demands are accelerated, because now there's an advocate within the very center of power in the British Parliament. And when Naoroji returns for the first time to India after being elected, literally 1 out of every 2 people in Bombay, 500,000 people show up to greet him and welcome him home. It's a big moment, and people like Gokhale or Bal Gangadhar Tilak or Alan Octavian Hume come to greet him and really kind of hold him as being the preeminent Indian nationalist of his day. So Naoroji served in Parliament for a good 3 years, and while in Parliament, he oftentimes spoke in quite bold language. In some debates, he'd call out the British for being, as is shown in this cartoon, an alien people. Once or twice, he compared the fate of Indians in India to that of slaves in the American South before the Civil War. He said Indians might actually be poorer and more mistreated than slaves. So he spoke out in quite a bold manner, but ultimately his stint in Parliament was quite disappointing. Very few British parliamentarians actually listened to him. There were some very close friends who supported him, but by and large, India was not a topic of concern for most MPs. So in 1895, Naoroji campaigns again for re-election, and he loses. And this really is kind of the lowest point in Naoroji's political career. because he's lost election, he's lost his voice in parliament, and he comes to the conclusion that it's very hard, much harder than he had conceived of, to convince Britons that there was a need for political reform in Britain. So if you're advocating reform and you're advocating some form of self-government in India, you couldn't just do this in Great Britain. You had to do this on a more broad-based fashion. And this is when Naoroji really starts to openly talk about the need for Swaraj. The first time Naoroji talks about self-government publicly is in 1884, but he quickly stops talking about it in order to campaign for parliament. Because obviously when, if you're trying to campaign for parliament, talking about Indian self-government is probably not going to endear you with many people. It's much better to be more moderate and talk about something like Indian political rights. But after he loses election and he's in this moment of despondency, he says, enough is enough. We must speak as we feel. Beginning in this period and in the very early 20th century, he starts openly talking for self-government. And there are a few factors which explain why he becomes more radical precisely at this stage. One factor was that the political party that comes to power in Great Britain was the Conservatives. So once more, you have quite reactionary politics being put in place in terms of Indian policy. There's very little interest amongst the politicians at this point in time in what Indians are thinking about and just how poor they are. And at precisely the same time, you have a vast famine sweep Western India, which touches places like Bombay or Gujarat and parts of northern India, which is followed up thereafter by a devastating plague epidemic. And in both the famine and plague, again, millions of lives are lost. And so people like Naoroji and Henry Hinman, as well as Michael Davitt, the Irish revolutionary who was interested in India, start to write and talk a lot about the need for Indian rights, because both famine and plague showed that British rule was causing the average Indian to suffer tremendously. They, again, linked British rule directly with these cataclysmic events going on. But the other factor that really started to get Naoroji thinking about empire and its influences around the world did not just concern the British Empire. It concerned about what was going on in the other rising power at this point in time, namely America. Now, from his very early economic writings during the 1860s and the 1870s, Naoroji had long been interested in the economic trajectory of the United States. He wrote about how while the United States was getting richer and richer under self-government, India was getting poorer and poorer under colonial rule. While America was expanding in a good way through railroads, India was growing poorer through the building of railroads. And in 1898, there's something called the Spanish-American War that takes place, where the United States goes to war against Spain and seizes numerous Spanish colonies, like Puerto Rico, Cuba for a short while, the Philippines, as well as many islands in the South Pacific, such as Guam or other areas like parts of Samoa. And the fact that America was now embarking on its own colonial exploits prompted Naoroji to get in touch with American anti-colonial individuals. So here Naoroji becomes the first Indian nationalist to start talking to Americans critical of empire. And they exchange ideas on what the British Empire and the American Empire are doing to colonial people. They exchange their economic analysis of the bad things that colonialism inflicts upon colonized people, and how empire was actually against the interests of the British and the American people in general. So Naoroji enters into conversation with one individual in particular, a man called George Freeman, who I unfortunately don't have his photo of, but he was also an Irish revolutionary who was living in New York, and he was someone who supported Irish independence as well as Indian self-government. But he was also connected with a group of people known as the American Progressives. And these were anti-colonialists in America who advocated reform of the American government against corruption. You know, they were kind of like a major anti-corruption lobby in America in the early 20th century. And the leader, or at least one of the main leaders of this group, was a man called William Jennings Bryan, who tried on several occasions to run for the presidency of America. Never made it, but he was nevertheless quite a significant figure in his own right. And William Jennings Bryan was also an extremely vocal critic of American imperialism and spoke out against the capture of the Philippines and Puerto Rico after the Spanish-American War. And in a few of his articles and speeches, Bryan specifically used the writings of Dadabhai Naoroji and Henry Hinman to argue that ultimately colonialism was a bad thing. It caused a drain of wealth, and it ultimately led to poverty and rebellion, which ultimately hurt those people who were in the first place colonizing those people. So it would hurt America just as it was hurting Great Britain in terms of building up all this ill will amongst the colonial people towards the British or the American nation. So here you have kind of like a cross-fertilization of views between American anti-imperialists, British anti-imperialists, and also Indians like Naoroji in the nationalist camp. So that was one way in which Naoroji expanded his global economic views. The other way in which he expanded his economic and political networks was by reaching out to socialists around the world. In 1904, he attends a socialist convention that takes place in Amsterdam, and this puts him in touch with people like Rosa Luxemburg or Karl Kautsky. Others like Henry Hinman also attend. And so here you have, during the first international, issues of colonialism being brought to the fore by a colonial subject himself. And this, again, really helps firm together an alliance between international socialism and Indian nationalism, which is, of course, taken on in later years by people like P.K.G. Kama, and eventually, from that point onward, by people like M.N. Roy and such. So here you have, again, Naoroji at the very beginning of another fruitful alliance in India's nationalist trajectory. Now, Naoroji looked outwards from Great Britain and India elsewhere to parts of the world where Indians lived, the Indian diaspora. It is around this time that Naoroji starts talking to a young Mahatma Gandhi who's in South Africa, and he starts to help Mahatma Gandhi in his efforts to ameliorate the conditions of Indians living in South Africa. Now, while Naoroji is doing this in South Africa, he's also talking to Indians in British Guyana and South Africa, Indians living in Madagascar. He's talking to Indians in Australia, Fiji, as well as Indians living in Great Britain itself, or on the continent in Europe. So he, again, becomes kind of like the first important diasporic political figure, someone who's taking all these nodes of contact between different parts of the Indian diaspora and connecting them with a nationalist base in India. Now, the last component that I'll really talk about in Naoroji's global vision is people beyond, colonial subjects beyond those living in the Indian subcontinent. Naoroji became very interested in the global African diaspora. So Blacks who were living in places like the West Indies or London, or Blacks in America who primarily lived in the American South. And in the late 1890s, there was a group called the Pan-African Conference, which communicated evidently with the Indian and also because the Pan-African Conference had an office right next door to the Indian National Congress in London. They were neighbors in a building in Westminster, very close by to Parliament. And again, Naoroji was involved in this cooperation between Blacks and Indians. So he starts talking to Black Americans who come visiting to London. He gets interested in the plight of Blacks in the South, and specifically talks against the epidemic of lynchings that takes place in the American South. And he befriends West Indians in London who themselves are running for political office in order to stimulate political demands in their homes in places like Trinidad and Tobago and other parts of the Caribbean. So this is the global component of Naoroji's idea of self-government. So while he's talking about Indian self-government at home in India, he's also talking about emancipation or rights of other people around the world as well, whether they be, people who are under the new American empire, or Blacks, or Indians living in other parts of the British Empire. And in 1906, he is invited to be president of the Indian National Congress in Calcutta. And this is a pivotal moment because at this point in time, the Congress is bitterly, bitterly divided between extremists and moderates, as you well know, between people like Gokhale and people like Tilak. And Naoroji was really the only acceptable candidate for both the extremist and the radical camp because he was believed to be a member of both camps. Many extremists believed Naoroji to be like them, but they felt he was a little too moderate. And many moderates believed Naoroji to be like them also, but they believed him to be too extremist. So Naoroji was kind of caught in the middle. And when Naoroji goes to Calcutta in 1906 and gives his Congress address, first of all, he's 81 years old. He's extremely old, right? At this point in time, this is the last political speech he'll give. He determines the future course of the Congress. He gives a speech which accepts many platforms that the moderates held dear, so this idea of constitutional agitation. He deplores violence, but at the same time, he gives a fillip to the radicals. He talks about Swaraj, he talks about self-government, he supports ideas like Swadeshi, and this really gives a great deal of support to people like Tilak. So if you look at the reaction of Indian nationalists after the 1906 Congress, you see people like Tilak or even Bipin Chandra Pal being quite optimistic. They think that Naoroji has swayed the balance in the Congress in their direction. And as we all know, the year after 1907, the Congress formally splits in Surat. The radicals and the moderates divide amongst themselves. So Naoroji had his own role to play in that split. He gave a bit of an encouragement in that direction, more toward radical politics. So this brings me to the end of my talk. So let me end at least by talking a little about Naoroji's modern day relevance. Naoroji is, of course, overshadowed in terms of his importance in nationalism by people like Gandhi and Nehru, but he was really in many ways a foundational figure. Naoroji knew Gandhi. I don't believe he ever met Nehru, but he probably knew of his father quite well. But both of their careers in many ways reflected Naoroji's ideas. Both were global thinkers. Both were ultimately concerned with ideas of Indian poverty, and both, of course, embraced and developed the idea of Swaraj that Naoroji championed toward the end of his life. So as we think about the broader sweep of Indian nationalism, I think it's very important to consider the first Indian to really be in the position of an Indian nationalist, Naoroji, and consider how his ideas are relevant for today. And I'll just end by saying that if you're interested to know more about Naoroji, his life, and the book, if you go to my website over here, you'll find a little bit more information about aspects of his career, his writings, and such. So with that, I'll end my presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, sir, for this very enlightening, very enriching lecture.
Thank you.
I think one question that should be asked is, do we see anyone with such ideology and such thought process in current Indian politics? Because the Prime Minister recently said that India have to be self-reliant. So do we see any one similar to Dadabhai Naoroji?
Right. There's, I also have been somewhat interested by this discussion of like Swadeshi principles in light of COVID and in light of what's going on vis-a-vis India and China. Perhaps to a certain degree, but ultimately, the ideas that Naoroji was talking about were very different from the ideas that are being talked about now, right? I mean, they were ultimately concerned about the poverty of India. They weren't concerned about things like conflict with China or the need to build some sort of economic hedge against a Chinese threat. In fact, in this era, many nationalists look to places like China or Iran or Turkey or Japan and try to see what can we learn from them in terms of how they have been able to grasp their own political liberation from colonialism or mold their own national government. So the ideas are quite different. Roji and his colleagues were very outward looking in terms, even when they talked about Swadeshi, they still saw India as an interconnected part of the world. They probably still could have conceived of India playing a global role in trade, but they wanted India to be, benefiting from the same benefits that, say, Great Britain had through certain protectionist policies or tariffs and such like that.
Yes. I was reading one of the articles, an excerpt from a book that during the late 1860s and early 1870s, Naroji proposed solutions to the drain were relatively limited in scope. Somewhat incredibly, he believed that part of the drain was justified. So, can you talk about that a bit?
So the other important thing to consider with Nauroji or any early Indian nationalist, and this is something which I think people have justifiably criticized me for in my book. I didn't pay enough attention to it. Is what do we say about loyalism, right? I mean, people like Nauroji or Gokhale or Ranade would say we are loyal British subjects. We believe in the British Empire. We think the British Empire is good. Um, how do we take those statements and contextualize them with the fact that, ultimately they talked about something like self-government? It's a really tricky topic, right? Um, and the way I at least would see, to answer your question is two ways. First of all, much more loyalist and much more positive towards the British the younger they were. As they grew older and older, and as they investigated more about poverty and they realized more about the damage that British imperialism was doing to India, they became less, loyal, if you will, right? I mean, they still might say we believe in some idea of British justice, but what they meant by that is an open question, right? So when Nauroji first talks about self-government, he talks about self-government specifically within the British Empire. So India could be something like Canada or Australia, whereas the British monarch is still in charge, but by and large, Canada and Australia have self-government. But in the very last speech he gives, he says, so in that sense, India could have self-government like Canada or Australia, like those regions in the British Empire, or it could be like Great Britain, a sovereign nation that's not really part of anything overriding, right? So you start to see hints of this idea being slowly abandoned. Ultimately, no one could say that if you're sitting in the 1880s and you say I hate the British Empire and I'm a disloyal subject, your career is over, right? You'll be locked up in jail. That's the end of you. I mean, Tilak found this out quite quickly, and again, up until the 19 teens, people like Gandhi was themselves calling themselves loyal British subjects. So oftentimes loyalty meant different things, and people could hide behind a shield of loyalty and say a lot of stuff.
Hmm. So it was used as a safeguard in a way.
In one way, yeah. I mean, it's still, again, we shouldn't discount that there probably was still an element of belief in this idea of British justice or British goodness, but how that translated into what the
Uh, so, in one of the articles I was reading about the book that you have mentioned that there was a tinge of disappointment later in his life, as you mentioned in the later part of your lecture, as an Indian nationalist movement split into the moderate and the extremist groups, leading to the mayhem during the 1907 Congress session in Surat. So, do we find any sources in his writings, in his letters about this, about the division in the movement between the radicals and the moderates, and his conflict of ideas between both, among both the camps?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, 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 I can hear.
Okay. Um, so, unfortunately, very few of his own letters survive from this period, but a lot of the incoming letters survive. So, for example, there are letters from people like Bhupendranath Basu or people like Tilak or Gokhale or Dinsha Vacha, and they are, of course, speaking from their different perspectives. So, people like Basu or Vacha or Gokhale are saying the Congress is at a crisis. The radicals are trying to derail everything. We need your help. At the same time, Tilak is writing and saying, look, what we, the radicals, are suggesting is really not that different from some of the ideas you're talking about, Swaraj, but our methods are different.
Hmm.
Whereas we and you both talk about Swaraj, we are talking about Swaraj through things like boycott or national education. So Tilak was trying to convince Nauroji to join his stream of thought, whereas people like Gokhale and the other moderates were saying, no, please come to our camp. Otherwise we'll be led off onto a radical stream. Unfortunately, we don't have many of the letters that Naoroji himself wrote. So, if you're asking about specifically how he was conflicted, we don't really know what he was saying, but we have a good idea of what was influencing at this point in time.
So, do you think that during the last phase of Dadabhai Naoroji's life, that he he agitated even in London, that he once said that you have brought India to this condition by the constant drain upon the wealth of this country. So, was he becoming more radical against the Britishers in the last part of his life?
Absolutely, yeah. So again, going back to the first question that you're talking about, I mean, if you look at Naoroji's life, during his first few decades, he was, he would say a lot of stuff that would classify us as being a little shocking. British rule is good. Some of the drain is justified. British have done this good, but they've done this bad. I mean, when he gives one of his first talks on the poverty of India, he actually has a spreadsheet where he says, or what we'd call a spreadsheet, where he said, the British have done this bad, but they've done this good. And over time, he slowly abandons again, as he grows older, he becomes more radical. And a lot of British people start to notice this. So, one of the individuals who Naoroji was in great conflict with in his last years was a man called George Hamilton. George Hamilton was a conservative, and he was the Secretary of State for India in London at this point in time. So Curzon was in power just at the time that George Hamilton was Secretary of State. And Hamilton, writes all these awful things to Curzon and also to Naoroji, talking about how Naoroji is a disloyal person, he's seditious, all these people are, just causing chaos and stuff. So he gets under the skin of a lot of British imperial figures by the end of his life.
So we'll take two questions from the audience that I saw. First was, I think, just does Naoroji's theory of drain of wealth have any relation with his business experience of cotton, where his firm got bankrupt? This is a question by Sambit Roy Chaudhary.
One instance where Naoroji realized how the world was globally interconnected and how things happening as far away as, say, America or Great Britain was causing India to grow poorer. So, yes, absolutely. Because when he goes bankrupt, many of his friends also go bankrupt as well, right? And he spends the next decades of his life trying to pay off these debts. So it's very personal. And again, just right after that, the Orissa famine takes place. So he sees again how poverty affects him first, and then, his friends, and then the Indian nation at large. A good book to read to think about these ideas is Sven Beckert's Empire of Cotton. He really shows again how, cotton networks at this point in time really were through things like cotton and through things like the American Civil War.
So this will be the last question from Priyanka Matthew, that did Gandhi and Naoroji write to each other? If so, what was the content of their interaction? Maybe in South Africa or...
I think the last bit of what you said got cut off. Sorry.
Yeah, so what was the content of the interaction between Gandhi and Naoroji, if it was ever done?
So that's another great question. And the unfortunate answer is that a lot of the letters are lost. So the earliest surviving letter from Gandhi to Naoroji, which we know was existing in the 1930s when the first biography was written on Naoroji, is lost. So we can only find out snippets of what they talked about. You can read a lot of Gandhi's letters to Naoroji if you look at the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. But Naoroji's letters to Gandhi, by and large, some are there, not a lot of them are there. A lot of them are very technical, because basically what Gandhi did is he took everything that was going on in South Africa, wrote about them. So all the different, oppressive pieces of legislation or the experiences Indians had in South Africa, and he transmitted them to state or sympathetic politicians or maybe even the prime minister. So Naoroji was kind of like the nodal agent to get the word out about what Gandhi was saying in the center of empire. So a lot of what he's saying is just kind of repeating the facts of what's going on the ground. There's not a lot of stuff about where they're both talking about their ideas. That, unfortunately, is not there.
So thank you very much, sir, for this wonderful post-lecture discussion and as well as the wonderful presentation that you gave this evening. I think
Thank you
everybody
very much.
loved it, and somebody is saying that you deserve 10 masala dosas for such a great discussion.
I'll happily take that up in the future once we're able to go outside. Let me just end by saying thank you very much for inviting me for this. I think it's a great initiative you guys have, especially while we're all locked in our houses. It's I guess the one silver lining of this experience is now we have a lot of time to sit at home and read. And it's a great time to just think about how history tells us a lot about the particular moment we're in, not just in India, but globally, right? Politically and in terms of what's going on with, this epidemic as well. So again, just in closing, thank you very much. And hopefully we'll get to meet.
Yeah. So thank you very much, sir, and thank you very much everyone who joined us live this evening.